So now we'll talk specifically about timelines and budgets. Here, the objectives are to learn how to create realistic timelines. We will work with a tool called the work breakdown structure. I will explain. We'll look at links and dependencies as we're doing the timeline. We will talk about the structure of a proposal budget, the major components, and then we'll look at two different approaches, top to bottom or bottom to top approach. Timelines and budgets. I did mention briefly before that they are key elements of the proposal. If the budget does not make sense or the timeline does not make sense according to the scope of work that is proposed, that is an indication that the investigator doesn't actually quite understand what needs to be done and what is required to get it done. So a timeline, you hear timeline and you hear schedule. Those are two different things. A timeline is a graphical representation. It's a picture. Well, a schedule is not a picture. A timeline is a graphical representation of a chronological sequence of events that integrates all project activities. You see an example here of a timeline. When you see that it's chronological, meaning that it is set up in time, it shows project activities. And then on this timeline, you see the integration because of the links between different activities in the timeline. The timeline has to be consistent and coherent. It really needs to reflect how the activities will be conducted and when they will be conducted in order to meet project deadlines. For example, if the funder funds the project for 18 months, you cannot come and propose a 24-month timeline. If, for example, you are following a pregnancy for beginning to end, we know that it's between 9 and 10 months. You cannot say that you'll follow the pregnancy for 6 months. So you have to be coherent, you have to be realistic in your activities and in the timeline. Again, the timeline is a graphical representation. The funders like to see it this way. They'd like to see like a one-shot timeline in one page. Even if you can have a project schedule that is a lot more detailed, but the timeline is like at a glance. Like once you look at it as a picture, you can see how the activities will be accomplished over time and how the activities are linked. That's the timeline. Now the project schedule is the list of activities with their start and finish date. It doesn't have to be in form of a picture. It can be a table in Word or in Excel. So the schedule does not have to be in form of a picture, but the timeline needs to be in form of the picture because at a glance, a reviewer needs to see how time will be used to meet project objectives. The main goal is to be able to show that the research team will be able to complete the project within the time allotted by the funders. The funders are usually specific. They give you 12 months to do this, 18 months to do that, or sometimes they have 5-year, 3-year, 5-year projects. You have to be able to show how you will use the time allotted to do the work. The timeline is to take into consideration assumptions and constraints and risk that are required that might come into play in completing the project objectives. For example, earlier I was talking about having a slow administration. One of the biggest problems of research here in Cameroon is the ethics committee review. Our ethics committee, the guidelines, the country guidelines is to have national ethics review of all research projects, and also administrative authorization from the Ministry of Health. The ethics committee, the National Ethics Committee meets every 2 months. Those are constraints that you have to take into consideration and putting together your timelines. You might have constraints with maybe shipment of reagents. You have to be able to forecast that risk and put it into your timeline. Now, in creating project timeline, first you have to have your scope of work, meaning what needs to be done. Either it's in your protocol or in your proposal. Now, the way I learned it when I was taking project management courses, I learned to do a work breakdown structure. We'll see it. We'll see what it is. So once you create your work breakdown structure, you basically divide your packages of work into tasks. You determine your dependency, what comes before what, and then you link them together. And by linking them together, you end up with a total time of what is needed. First for each task and for the research project as a whole. You need to identify your resource availability. Let's say that you need to hire nurses if you're doing a study in the clinic. Or maybe you don't need to hire nurses, but you have nurses in your clinic already, or the clinic that you're going to work in. But are they available to do this research work since they already have their own work? If you need a nurse for 10% of the time, that means about half a day in a 5-day work week. Does that nurse have 4 hours to give you every week to work on your project? Those are things you have to take into consideration. You need to identify important milestones, and then all of that together, you build your timeline. So here's an example of a work breakdown structure. Basically, what you need to do, you take your entire project and you break it down into smaller and manageable portions. Here, I'm giving the example of building a house. On this particular slide, I'll give you the example of building a house. It's a daunting project. If you think about, oh, I have to build a house, it's big, it's daunting. But if you break it down into different portions, then you can see how each particular task can be accomplished. So before actually even putting the timing on activities, first break it down so you know what needs to be done in terms of activities. That way you can see it a little bit more easier and you can be more effective. And in the end, it would actually make you more productive as you are realizing your timeline. Now, let's take this example of building a house. Here, it's broken down into 3 different major tasks. You have the internal work, the foundation work, and then the external work. In the internal work, you have electrical work, and then you have plumbing. Now, that's already one level of breaking down. You go one more. Inside the electrical work, what needs to be done. Here you have the roughing electrical, the terminals to install the HVAC system. Inside the plumbing work, you also have the roughing plumbing, the send up the plumbing fixtures, and then test and clean. So you see that each big work package is actually broken down into specific activities, and the activities are broken down further into smaller tasks. So the work breakdown structure, you start with a higher level and then you go down. You can go down as many levels as you are comfortable with. Here, I suggest 3 levels. You know, I usually give the example. Let's say that you have to refrigerate a sample. You can even break it down further. You open the refrigerator, you pick up the sample, you set the sample inside the refrigerator, you close the refrigerator. So this one simple task, I broke it down into 4 different smaller tasks. So everything can really be broken down. And to what level is the level that you are comfortable with, the level that would allow you to manage your resources and accomplish the work on time. So this is what is called a work breakdown structure. Here is another example of a work breakdown structure, and this is more in the science laboratory world. So the main task here is to identify the genetic marker and develop an assay for disease X. That's actually the projects. So now this particular aim or general aim is broken down into, there's a discovery phase and then an assay development phase. Within the assay development, the discovery phase, that's even broken down even further. You have the cell culture and then mouse studies. Within the cell culture, that's broken down even further. So here there's actually 4 levels, not the 3 levels that I presented before. Within the cell culture, you have your cell assays, your expression analysis, and then within the mouse studies, you have you need to breed your animals and then do the genotype phenotype analysis. Same thing on the other side in developing the assays. So this is what is called a work breakdown structure. You basically take the main aim and objectives, you break it down into work packages. The work packages, for example, can be, let's say you can have a laboratory work package, you can have a regulatory work package, you can have a clinical work package, you can have a data management work package. And all of these work packages then needs to be broken down into activities that goes into each, and the activities need to be broken down into smaller tasks. That way you have a better picture of the details of all the work that needs to be done. That way also, that will give you the pictures in such a way that you can see what's missing. You can see what's missing. If you don't go through this work breakdown structure, you might have missing activities that you don't take into consideration into your timeline, and that will affect meeting the deadlines in the long run. But by breaking down your work in this manner, you can better have a better image of what needs to be done. Now, I talked about dependencies and links. When you have tasks that need to be completed, you need to know what task depends on another task in order to meet your objectives. I was talking about ethical clearance before. in practically everywhere, in every country of the world, there are directives when you're doing research with human participants. You have to have ethical clearance. That means that an ethical committee has reviewed your protocol and has given you permission to conduct that protocol as it is written. It is not ethical to start your research study before having that ethical clearance. Ethical clearance is extremely important, particularly in not only because as a researcher you want to do the right thing, but once you are submitting your results for publication, the publishers many times will ask you for the clearance. So since this is a key and critical item in your timeline, starting the actual work with the participants, starting your consent process, you cannot start your content process before having this ethical clearance. So this is a dependency that you cannot go around. Such dependencies you have to keep in mind, and you have to plan accordingly. There are 4 different dependencies that are usually spoken of. You have the finish to start, start to start, finish to finish, and then start to finish. I will explain. The finish to start dependency actually means that you usually have task A and then task B. Finish to start, meaning that task A needs to be completed before you start task B. That's a finish to start dependency. That goes back to my example about the ethical clearance. You cannot start enrolling participant, meaning recruiting participant or administering consent to your participant until you have completed ethical clearance or ethical review. So that's a finish to start relationship that you have to take into consideration. You also have a start to start dependency, which basically means that task A need to start at the very same time as task B, for example. For example, I'm thinking about, being in the laboratory and you are doing your sample preparation. There can be some instances where, for example, you have 2 different reagents that you need to prepare at the same time, because this is particularly important to the assay that you are running. So you need to start both reagent preparation at the same time, or else your assay will not work as expected. So that's a start to start relationship. Now, in terms of finish to finish relationship, that's when task A needs to finish at the same time as task B. They may start at different times, but they have to finish at the same time. An example is, for example, that if you have different parties that need to sign a contract, the contract cannot be executed until all parties have finished the signature, the signing of the contract. So that's finish to finish. These days, people are not even traveling, so everything is done online by email. So you might be expecting different collaborators to sign the contract It doesn't matter when the signing process started, but everybody needs to be finished with the signing at the same time in order for the contract to be executed. That's a finish to finish relationship. Now, a start to finish relationship it's rare, but it can happen. And it's also different from a finish to start relationship. With a start to finish relationship, you basically need task A to start when task B is completed. Now, even conceptually, it's a little bit difficult. The only example that I can think of is, for example, if I go back to the contract signing example. So in some instances, it might be the terms of the contract with the funder might say that you need to have the contract signing process started before you can receive funding. So the contract processing, the contract signing process will be task A, and then the funding will be task B. So even though you didn't finish the contract signing, you can still receive at least part of the funding, a percentage. Maybe it's 50% so that you can get going. So task A, contract signing started, but funding was given. So it needs to start so that funding can be given, and that first funding can be task can be received, and so that task B is finished, even though task A has not finished, but it needed to start. It's a little bit different from finish to start, because that very first dependency, in that very first dependency, finish to start, task A needs to finish, and then task B needs to start. The last one, task A needs to start before task B can finish, even though task A is not finished. So those are dependencies. I'm going to go through the next slides quickly because I realized that I had not done them properly. So I could not present the slides that I went through. There were images there that I did not edit. But I did explain the dependencies. But when we get the presentations, the images will be edited. I mentioned before that the timeline that you're presenting to the funder is a graphical picture. It's a picture. It's a graphical representation. It's a picture. They want to be able to see in one page at one glance how all the activities are planned, how they will be, the amount of time that they will require in order to meet their deadlines. Grants are not open usually. They have a usually very strict deadline. And by presenting your timeline, by taking into consideration all of the activities and being realistic with how the work will be conducted and when it will be conducted over time, you give the reviewer confidence that you actually understand what needs to be done and what it takes to get it done. That's the timeline. All right, now let's talk about budgets. The budget, just like the timeline, is also another tool to provide the reviewer with confidence. Now, we're talking about money. Money is sensitive. in many instances, the funding that is available for research are public funds. Public funds means that the funds came from taxpayers. And that money is to be managed extremely carefully, because this is people's contribution to their governments. And the government earmark that money for research. So sometimes it seems cumbersome, but the regulations that the funders put in place for their budgets really need to be respected, because the funders themselves are accountable for how the money is used. And they usually give you guidelines. They give you budget guidelines, usually, that you need to follow in budgeting your projects. If they give you guidelines and you don't follow it, you're shooting yourself in the foot. Even though it might be extremely difficult, you might not even see the points of certain things that they're asking you. Here's an example. Here in Cameroon and in many African countries that I've been to, when you take a taxi, you don't get a receipt for the taxi. But the funders ask you to justify all your expenses. How do you justify a taxi for 250 francs? Which is like, what, 25, no, 250 francs, 50 US cents. How do you justify that? But they are required to ask you for justification for every expense. So you need to justify. Sometimes in this situation, here in Cameroon, for example, you cannot ask a taxi driver for a receipt. But in my projects, I actually set up a form for those expenses that I cannot obtain, for which I cannot obtain receipts. So I fill out the form, for example, for a taxi, I put my name, I put the date, I put the time, I took a taxi from this place to this place, and it costs this much. It's not a receipt from the taxi, but it is a documentation that I spent the money. And some funders actually will require you will have a threshold of expenses that they do not ask for receipts for, but some don't. The important thing is to follow the funder's instructions. The budget and the budget justification section will show that as a researcher, you have a good understanding of the materials, the equipment, the personnel, and all the other resources that are required to implement your study the way you proposed it. It's very specific what you have to put in the budget. If you're saying that you are running a study, and I'm sorry, I keep taking, I'm an epidemiologist, so everything that I do is with human beings and on the field. So that's my references. Those are my references. You are running a study where you are looking at, for example, the incidence of a particular disease in a particular setting, maybe in a community, in a village or something. So you have to go into the clinic maybe to be able to see the number of new cases that arrive into that clinic. What do you require to do that study? You have to know what you will need. You will need field workers. If you're doing the diagnosis yourself, are you using the laboratory? If you use the laboratory in the facility, Do you need the equipment for that particular test? Maybe they don't have it. Do you need reagents for that particular test? They don't have it. The study personnel that you need, you have to justify. If you only need half a day of one nurse, you cannot come and say that you need 5 nurses, because you will be over budgeting and it will show. And what does it show the reviewer? It shows the reviewer that you don't understand what you need. So every single expense you need to justify. Here are the typical budget categories. Personnel. So for each personnel, you need a salary. You may not use everybody full time. Sometimes you will hear of something called full-time equivalent. If you have one full-time equivalent, that means that you need that post. You need the expertise for that post available for 40 hours a week, which is a full-time week. That does not particularly mean that you need one person for those 40 hours, 100%. You might need 2 people, 50% and 50%, if you need a full-time equivalent. Things like that you need to know. You need to know the base salary and all the fringes that get added to the salaries, if that is allowed by the funder. Because some funders will pay a salary, but they won't put the fringes, and the fringes might come in the indirect cost. And sometimes here in Africa, the information is not always readily available. But if you don't know, for example, what you should put for a salary for a data manager, because you've never done that before, go speak to people that have budgeted before, other researchers that have budgeted before, and then you can see what is typical for a data manager. But it's the information that you need to have. Services, sorry, let me go to equipment. Equipment, what do you need? What tools and apparatus do you need in order to accomplish your project objectives? If you are, for example, you're drawing blood, where will you put the blood after you draw it? EDTA tubes? How many tubes do you need? You need, you're doing full blood count. Do you have a cell counter? Do you need to buy it? You have to know all these things. Services, this is expertise that are not found inside your institution. For example, I might need, in my institution, I may not have a social scientist, but I might have some qualitative data to collect. Then I will need an expert as a social scientist that needs to be here. I might need for tuberculosis studies, sometimes you need chest x-rays. So you might need a radiologist that you might not have in your institution. Travel. Your travel, you need to take into consideration local travel. So the transportation that is actually needed to conduct your studies. Maybe the transportation from the field workers to go from site to site. Maybe transportation to carry samples from one site to the laboratory. Things like that, transportation to meetings, transportation to trainings, that goes on the travel. And then you have non-local travel, like international travel. Somebody spoke about the communication dissemination plan. It's possible that in your dissemination plan, you need to go present your results in an international conference. That's non-local travel, international travel. That needs to be taken into consideration. And you have to be realistic. It costs about, let's say in US dollars, between 500 and 1,000 US dollars to go from Cameroon to France. Well, 500 actually is cheap. Let's say 800 and 1,500. I cannot say I need a $5,000 first class ticket. That makes no sense. So whatever you decide to cost out has to be realistic and it has to be economical. Your materials and supplies, even office supplies, you need to take into consideration. Paper, pens, photocopying cartridges, ink. If it's in the laboratory, laboratory work, this is where a lot of the cost is located. Materials and supplies and equipment. You have to know what you need for each of your particular activities. And then you have other expenses. Sometimes you can have incentives to for the participants, tuition. If you're doing a capacity building project, you might have to pay for tuition for your PhD students. So these are typical budget categories. Of course, this can be broken down even further. For the salaries, it really depends on what you need to do your work. It goes through the whole gamut. It depends on what you need to do your work. I think I already spoke about the equipment, materials and supplies. Now, it's important, especially here in Africa, to take into account communication, because there's a difference between us here, the way we pay for telephone and internet service, as opposed to countries in Europe or in the Western countries. Here, the telephone communication is paid per use as you use it. So we may not have phones in our offices, while in Western countries, they have phone service in their offices. So here, when you're conducting a study, you need to call somebody, you need to have credit in your phone. So that needs to be taken into consideration, which is not always something that they take into consideration in Western countries. You have to take how things work locally. If you're doing paper form data collection, the questionnaires, sometimes I've had studies with several thousands of participants, that the copying takes quite a lot of money and a lot of paper. That needs to be taken into consideration. So this is just a few things that we talk about when we talk about materials and supplies. I talked about travel. When you're budgeting international conferences, you have to take into consideration the flight, like I said, the hotel costs. You don't want to go and stay in a 4-star hotel. Sometimes they even give you they give you some specific guidelines on how much to cost out for per diems. Per diems depend on the country. Coming to a conference in Cameroon, it might be a different per diem cost than going to South Africa, for example, or going to Europe, for example. That needs to be taken into consideration. Some funders might allow you to budget for a car rental, or some might even allow you to budget for purchasing a car or many cars. But you really need to know what is allowed by reading the instructions. I talked about different services. Translation. Let me mention a little bit of translation. If you need translation services, which in many instances you do, but particularly, let's say that if you have to do informed consent in local languages, and you don't have people inside your organization to do it, then you have to pay for translation services. Or if, for example, all your communication with the funders are in English, all your documentation have to be in English. But here in Cameroon, we are English and French speaking. So in many instances, we have to translate documents in French, because if you are in the French-speaking part of the country, you cannot use the English documents. If you are in the English part of the country, you cannot use the French documents. So that you have to take into consideration. I spoke about the others. Other is just basically any expenses that doesn't fit into the categories that I explained before. And then remember, you have to justify. You have to justify your expenses. You cannot just give an amount of money that this costs such amount because it sounds good to you. It has to be justified. Here is an example of a budget justification. Let's say that I put down in my budget that I need the principal investigator has a certain salary. Now, it's very rare that you will see a PI involved in the project 100%, because as a PI, as an investigator, it makes sense that you are managing overseeing many research projects at the time. You're not supposed to just be overseeing one research project. So for this particular one, I said that I would need Dr. Mompe Akeba to provide 25% effort. And how do I justify this 25%? I say that Dr. Mompe will spend about 2 hours per day on project activities on average. She's responsible for clinical examinations of all patients in the study. The study calls for 100 enrolling participants to be examined at 2 months interval. So altogether, she'll have 600 examinations to do for the period of the study. She'll also participate in data analysis, and she will supervise data collection and oversee the overall administration of the project. By explaining it this way, the reviewer will have confidence that, yes, okay, 25% effort is okay. This is an example of justification. So I have other justifications here. Ms. Mark Akingolo, Senior Laboratory Technician, 100% effort. How is this explained? Because he will conduct 600 DNA analysis in 12 months. And that would make sense for somebody who knows what it takes to do 600 DNA analysis in 12 months. If you are purchasing major equipment, you need to justify the purchase. And sometimes you'll even be, if it's major equipment, sometimes you'll even be required to send 3 different quotes so that the funders can have reassurance that the amount that you budgeted is an actual amount. And then you explain why you need that particular equipment. Now that I'm just going to go through other different budget tips. I cannot say enough, be reasonable. Be reasonable. It looks really, really bad if the reviewer has the feeling that you're trying to over budget. I usually say that as a researcher, all I have is my name. Sylvie Kwedinona, that's it. And that name cannot be solid. It cannot be solid. That means it cannot be soiled. It cannot be, I don't want my reputation to be negatively affected because somebody has the feeling that I'm trying to get over. So be reasonable. Justify your expenses. It gives a reviewer confidence that you know what you're talking about and you know what it takes. It helps a lot to work on the budget with somebody who has extensive budgeting experience, especially if it's a large budget. because this person has an expert eye and the person can guide you. This makes sense, this doesn't make sense. The many funders, especially the major funders, they have directions. Follow them. If they say that they will not fund equipment that is more than 50,000 US dollars, don't put down that you're purchasing equipment that is worth more than 50,000 US dollars. If you really need that equipment, then figure out another way. Go back to your scope and figure out another way. We all want the crème de la crème budget, all the resources in the world, but we don't have all the resources in the world. So even if you want a Mercedes, ask for a Toyota, because that is more realistic. I have here that once you have the funds, you can be flexible in the use, but many instances, even that flexibility can only be so much. Because many funders, they actually make you stick to the budget, which is quite disconcerting at times. Because remember, I think in the first module, I showed you the proposal review process. So you might write a proposal in 2020. It's in 2021, a year later, that you actually get the news that you got the grants. It's already been a year since you set up your budget. And so you get the news that you got the grant, you have a party, you're happy. Now you go into negotiations with the funders, because there's also a time for negotiation. There's a time for contract signing, which I have had from the time I got awarded to the time I actually received money for the grant, 12 months have gone by. So now you are 2 years away from when you first set up your budget. Things may have changed, but that is what you committed to. And so you have to be careful what you ask for. You have to make sure that you can actually do it for that amount of time. You might be able to explain a little bit, you might be able to be flexible just a little bit, but many funders, there's not much flexibility. You have to keep that in mind. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about 2 different types of budgeting. There's a top to bottom or bottom to top. I'll start with top to bottom. Top to bottom basically means that you start with your overall amount. Let's say that the grant asks for a budget of $1 million US dollars. So you start with that 1 million and then you allocate per function. For example, you can say that, okay, the laboratory, since this is a laboratory-based project, the laboratory will probably take 50% of the budget. The clinical cost, maybe 10%. Personnel, maybe 20%. So you go from the main amount and then you distribute it within the function. Now, 50% of 1 million is 500,000. Now you said you needed 50%, so 500,000 US dollars for the laboratory. Now it's inside that 500,000 that you cost out the project. Me particularly, I am not a fan of this approach, because to me, you will not end up with a realistic budget, but it's an approach that people use. What I would rather do is this one. What I would rather do is a top to bottom to top budget. So I start with the activities, list them out. Each task, I list them out. Patient recruitment. What do I need for patient recruitment? I need the people to do the work. I need paper form paper form consents. I may need a screening. Maybe there's a screening instrument. Maybe if my study requires me to have pregnant women, I may need a pregnancy test. So I list out everything that I need for each particular activity. The laboratory, I have this activity, this activity, this activity, this activity. I cost it out item per item needed to do the work for that particular function. And then I sum it up. So I go from the bottom up, and then that will give me my total budget. Now, that might mean that if the call was for $1 million US, I might be over. So then I have to go back to my objectives. If I had maybe 7 objectives, maybe I can only keep 2. I'm sorry, maybe I can only keep 5 and I can get rid of 2. So this is the bottom to top budgeting approach, which I prefer, because then you end up with more realistic budgeting. So if you put the 2 together, this is really what it looks like. And like I said, I really prefer bottom to top as opposed to top to bottom. All right, so I think I'm a little bit within the time, but you guys actually owe me 10 minutes, I think. So I will use it. So this is the 3rd module of the day, and it is the end of today. I would like us, and I know there's many of you, I see here 287. I would like us to have a writing exercise. Now, this is an exercise. Let me first explain the process. Because there's so many of you, please do not email me with all your responses. What's the point of this exercise is just to be a little bit interactive and to give the learners, which you are, the opportunity to actually speak and to write something. So what we'll do is that you will write a general objective of a research project that you either have or something that you have in mind, with 3 to 5 specific objectives for the research project. And then tomorrow, we will go by a show of hands, and we will give the microphone and the video, if possible, maybe, to maybe 3 or 4 people that can read out. 3 or 4 very courageous, very courageous individual, so that we can have a little bit of an exchange, which makes the experience of this workshop a bit more interesting. Okay, so that's the exercise, and I will leave it there to take questions. That allows us a little bit more time for questions.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Sigi. It's been a very interesting last session with so many interesting and varied questions coming up. And I think what we will do during this last session is I will pose a question, then you will just give the answer before, because when I give a question, it takes so much time. So I'll pose a question, you give the feedback, then we'll go to the next question, and then we'll move along that.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
That'd be
so
great.
Okay, the first question, I'll take it from bottom. The person said, does inflation have to be taken into account when making this budgeting?
Does inflation have to be taken into account? Okay, so usually we're talking about a period of a year, 2 years, 3 years. Particularly, I don't see inflation being taken into account, but what you do need to take into account is the exchange rates, especially if the money is sent to you in US dollars, because the US dollar fluctuates quite a bit. And you can be in the unfortunate situation where the US dollars, and I'm talking in now in relation to the CFA, the franc CFA, if the US dollar loses value, I think that it is, then you end up getting less money in the end for your study, because the original budget was maybe for this amount and the US dollars was worth 500 francs to the US dollars. And then if it loses value, then in the middle of your project, the US dollar is at 400 francs, then you basically lose 20% of your budget. You basically lose 20%. But you can also be in the fortunate situation where it gains value and then you have more money. So, but these things are usually spelled out in the contract.
Okay, good. So somebody asked a similar question in another direction. So when you have much money, then you've delivered all your activities within the time frame, and you have extra cash. What should you do? Do you send it back, or what do you do? What do you think? What do you do with the funding?
So once you get the funding and you're doing the work, you have to send reports. You have to send technical progress reports and then financial progress reports. So in your financial progress reports, you basically say what you have spent and what you have spent it on. And remember that you can get audited at any point. What did I say? My name, Sylvie Kwetinona. That's all I got. That's all I got, my name. I cannot dirty up my name. So I make sure that in my financial management, I am very, very, very transparent. If there's money left over, the funder might require you to send it back. And if they're required to send it back, then you have to send it back because you're on the contract.
Okay, so the other person said, okay, if your budget is not enough, is it possible to request for extra funding if you can justify why you need extra funding? Is it possible?
Most of the time, no. Most of the time, remember, these funders have money that is earmarked particularly to do a particular work. Most of the time, you cannot request extra funding. Maybe they might have another call for proposal, and then you will request another additional funding under a separate call for proposal. But most of the time, no. But I also have to say something. Sometimes you might have a lot of delays, and then at the end of the project period, you have not finished the work and you still have money. Then what you request is called a no-cost extension, meaning that they will extend the time for you to accomplish the work without giving you additional money.
Okay, so once one person said, is there a standard distribution of the different categories of the budget in terms of proportion? Because when you were presenting the budget, is there a standard distribution?
So I presented two approaches, a top-down and bottom-up. With the top-down, there's really not a standard. It depends on the amount of work that you need to do. That's why I prefer a bottom-up, where I will list out everything that needs to be done, cost out everything that needs to be done, item by item, item by item, added up to the bottom line. But okay, there's no particular distribution.
Okay. Okay. Somebody said you talked about the purchase of a car or rental, but in some of the projects like EDCP of the Horizon 2020, they are talking of depreciation rate. And looking at the context of Cameroon and
is that your own question, or are you reading, Leo?
No, it's a question. So, okay. So how do you go about it when we don't have those standards of depreciation? We have second-hand cars. We don't have cars that you can evaluate that it depreciates.
I know. It's a question that I have faced before. And to tell you the truth, I don't have an answer because the funder are expecting your institution to have these procedures in place. If your institution doesn't have it, then maybe you can say my institution doesn't have it, and then maybe ask from another institution, and then you follow those depreciation requirements. As long as you follow something, or maybe it's hard. It's really hard, and I really don't have the answer for that.
Okay. Okay. Somebody said, can we budget stipends for respondents? Some schools of thought believe that it's against research ethics. What is your view?
Well, ethically speaking, and I am a student of research ethics. Ethically speaking, you cannot pay people to participate in the research. That is called an undue influence, and that is unethical. But there are certain things that you can pay for. You can pay for the transportation to come to the facility. Let's say that you need them to come and give blood samples. You pay for the transportation to come and give blood samples. Let's say that you need them to eat a certain way for your study. Then you provide them with food, but you cannot pay for the participation, and you have to justify whatever payment you're giving to participants. You have to justify.
Okay, one other person said, difference between key deliverables and milestones within the research proposal. Are they both mandatory to be listed together? Yeah,
that's a very good question. And like I said, this workshop is actually set up to be a 5-day workshop, but because we are online, we have to do 2 half days. But there is a difference between a deliverable and a milestone. A deliverable is a tangible result of what needs to be tangible, meaning it has to be touched, it has to be seen, it has to be felt. Result that you have to deliver for the project, not particularly assigned to a particular timeline. As long as it's done, that's a deliverable. But it can also be attached to a time, of course. A milestone is a marker. A milestone is a marker, basically telling you, giving you an indication of where you are in terms of meeting your project objectives. For example, if I leave, right now I'm in Douala. If I leave Douala to go to Yaoundé, there's a certain path that I have to take. There's a certain road. On the road, it takes about average day, if there's no particular differences in traffic, 4 hours. But in the 4 hours that it takes from going from Douala to Yaoundé, there are markers. I know, for example, that in 1 hour after I leave Douala, I should be in Edea. So that's a milestone. I reach Edea in 1 hour. That's a marker. If I reach Edea in 20 minutes, maybe I was flying, I was not driving. So that means I went too fast because I'd reached the marker too soon. If I reach Edea in 2 hours, that means I was too slow. So the marker the milestones are markers along your timelines that basically show you how you're keeping track of your activities within the time that's allowed to do the activities.
Thank you. So must work breakdown package be included in all methodology or be specific to some calls? That's
no, it's a tool. It's a tool that I'm proposing for you to use. There are other tools that can be used. It's a tool. It's just, for me, it makes it a lot easier. It's not a requirement. It's a tool that I'm proposing.
Okay. Can your proposal be rejected because the budget is considered insufficient?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Like I said before, if the funders, they do not do things just like that. They actually take time to think about the call for proposals. It's not just randomly. They take time. So if they judged that in order to properly address this call, you might need about $1 million US, and you come up with a budget for 300,000 with all of the objectives that they know that you need a lot more. You might be feeling good about yourself that you're saving them money, but it doesn't make sense. And it's not even ethical. It's not even ethical to under budget. It's not ethical because in the end, you're shooting yourself in the foot if you're not budgeting appropriately. It's not, so it can definitely be rejected if you're under budget.
Okay.
Way under budget according to the reviewers' criteria.
Okay, can an institutional review board play the same role as the National Ethics Committee? Can an
in Cameroon, no. So it depends. Yeah, I heard your question. I heard the question. Can an institutional review board, IRB, play the same role as a National Ethics Committee? It really depends on your context. Where we are in Cameroon, no. In Cameroon, the guidelines, I'm not going to say the law because it's not a law, but there are government directives in terms of how research is to be conducted in Cameroon. And you need to go through the National Ethics Committee. Even if you have your IRB, institutional IRB review, you still need to go back to the National Ethics Committee. So okay. It depends on the context.
Okay. So Dr. Anya Delphine said, how do you budget for custom duties when given the fact that custom tax seem to be sometimes very violating the rules? So she's asking this question from UB, University of Buea.
Okay, so I mean, I'm assuming, yes, I'm assuming that you will not be the first person doing research at the University of Buea, ever. So you have to go and look, talk to other researchers. How did they do it before? What is the historical pattern in terms of custom clearance or duty taxes? What is the historical data that you can count on? That's what you have to base it on, because you will not be the first person to ever do the type of research that you're doing. So you have to since you need to justify everything in your justification for the custom or duty taxes, you have to say that this is based on this that was done on this. That's how you came up with the cost.
Okay. Should information about staff and team members be included in the proposal?
Information
about staff.
Information about, how? Maybe the curriculum, okay? The CV?
Maybe their names and maybe what you pay them. I think that's what the person was trying to say.
I see.
Members.
So it depends. The funder might require you to already have identified the people doing the job. For example, for some calls, the capacity building calls, when they ask you for, when they say that they will fund 2 PhDs, you will already need to have identified the PhD students. And sometimes, so you have to give their name, their CV, and sometimes they would even have to already give like a synopsis of their thesis. But many times you don't need to. If you need 5 nurses, then it's 5 nurses. You will not have to say nurses this and nurses this, nurses this, nurses this. Yeah.
Anyway, this question is, I think we have gone through it. Nick says, how does the budget affect acceptance of the award, of the grant award? I noticed that in the recent grant award, those with low budgets were not given. It mostly those with very high budget that were given the award, and only one was given to African researchers, and that was the least budget on the list of award.
Well, I would hate to think that decisions are made in terms of where the researcher came from. But like I said, the budget has to reflect the work. It has to reflect the work. You cannot think that it looks good to under budget. It has to be realistically reflective of the work.
Okay. So why do most calls come in 2 weeks to deadline, and it's hard to get the requirement for submission? Why do we always have calls coming in? They give you just 2 weeks to prepare your material and submit.
Well, I don't know if I can answer that question. What I have found is that it's not that the call came 2 weeks before. Sometimes is that you saw the call 2 weeks before. The call may have been published for a long time, and that you didn't see it, but you only saw it 2 weeks before the deadline. So it's rare for the funder to give you 2 weeks. It may just be that you saw it 2 weeks. And let me tell you a little secret. Sometimes there are people that are connected with different funders. So they are inside, and they know that the funder will publish on such and such dates. So sometimes you can have that information on the call even before the call is published. That gives you more time. It can happen. If it happens, you're lucky. But for those funders that give you 2 weeks for a large grant, it's not fair. But many times it's not that they gave you 2 weeks. It's just that you saw the call only 2 weeks before. And
okay.
Me, like I mentioned this at the beginning, if I know that I will not have enough time to write a competitive proposal, I won't even start. It takes time. I won't even start. I'd rather let that one go, wait for the next one.
Okay. So one old question: what's the difference between justification and research problem?
Excuse me?
What's the difference?
Justification is talking to the.
I mean, somebody said.
I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying, but I was just talking about budget justification. I hope they're not seeing this as the rationale, which I think in French you actually sometimes call it justification, where the rationale or the justification of the significance of your research, that is written in the introduction or the background section of the proposal. But when I was talking about justification in this particular module, I was talking about justification of your budget expenses, the costs that you put down.
Okay, so I think I've touched most of the questions. I don't know if I have left some out, but if I've left some out, so I think the network will help me to complete it online. Somebody just said she got disconnected a little bit, so she didn't get exactly what the assignment you gave. So I don't know if
let me go back to the assignment.
If they can share it again, maybe then the Global Health Network can post it to everyone so that they have at least they have a good clue of what the assignment is all about, so that they should be prepared.
Okay, I'll try just while we're here, and I think we have a couple of minutes to talk about the assignment again. Can you see my screen?
Yes, it's visible.
Okay, good. We're a little bit over time, but you guys owed me time anyway. So here is the writing assignment. Like I said, it's just a very small assignment in order to give you the chance to actually write down certain things and to give us, the panelists, the opportunity to comment on what you have written, because it is a workshop. It's quite difficult to do a workshop online, because a workshop means that you're actually working. It's not supposed to be a lecture, it's supposed to be a workshop. So the assignment is to write a general and specific objective, 2 to 3 specific objectives to your 1 general objective for any research project that you can think of. And then tomorrow, you will ask for volunteers. We'll ask for courageous people to come and present. So please do not email me. I don't want 300 emails. It's just write it down, and then tomorrow, if we can have 3 or 4 volunteers that can actually read the assignment. So that's the assignment.
Okay, so there are so many other questions.
Wow.
Yeah, so I think.
How much more time do we have?
No, we don't. I think
we are officially over time.
Yeah, over time. That's the truth. We are over time. And
I think we started late too.
Bonnie, there's one question I can't see. Can you please take over the question, Bonnie? Hello, Bonnie.
Hi, Leonard. Yes, we're sort of coming up for time now, but if Sylvie, if you're happy to take one more question, there are a lot, but yeah, we could just pick a couple more if you're happy to.
No problem.
Okay, great. Well, if I just ask one, I can hand back to Leonard. We've got one from Isabella Honeyborn, who has asked, some funders are asking for mitigation strategies for COVID-19, for example, lockdowns and restrictions. How best to write convincingly about how to deal with these unknowns in your application?
Okay, so one thing is for sure, each country has its own guidelines in terms of the restriction measures. It's very different here in Africa because the pandemic has affected us a little less and a little bit differently. So you really need to take that into consideration now. So for example, if there's a possibility, usually you do, I didn't talk about it here, but some funders will ask you for a risk analysis. So you have to come up with different risks that you can foresee and your mitigation plan for that particular risk. So, I mean, a year ago, nobody could have known, even foresaw that a pandemic such as this one could happen. But now that we know, if it happens, what do? You have to write it up. If even right now, I'm involved right now in a study that requires us to do key informant interviews and focus group discussion. We know that it might be if we were in a country where the pandemic was very, very, very severe, where there are lockdowns, we may not be able to do key informant interviews. Then face-to-face, in that case, what is your plan? Can you do it on the phone? If you have to do focus group discussion, can you do it on Zoom? With our internet connection? I don't know. But basically, you have to think it out. You have to think it out. Right now, we are in the pandemic, so you have to take into consideration what PPE do you need, and these are items that we did not think of before, and they cost a lot of money. It costs a lot of money to have the disposable gowns, to have the gloves, to have the masks, to have the what they call it, vizier, I think they call it. It costs a lot of money, and some funders actually take that into consideration and put a certain amount for PPE. But you have to think it out, and you have to provide a mitigation strategy that makes sense in your context.
Great. So somebody said, okay, they are so excited with these presentations, and please, when do we get access to the presentations? And so,
After we finish.
yeah.
If I send it now, nobody will show up tomorrow.
Exactly. That's right.
You
Yeah.
definitely have the presentation.
Okay. So somebody was asking about the recording. If they could get the recording, that would be fine. I think the Global Health Network is good on that. I think they always share some of the recordings. So
Yeah,
I think they will get access on their website. Yeah. I think then I just want to add this to participants. They should get to the Global Health Network on PDS, the Professional Development Scheme. It's a small questionnaire. It's a little bit long, but it helps you to build on your capacity. Then the system will build out your gaps, so that from the gaps, they will tell you the courses you can take to be a good grant writer also. So it's good to explore the site, as you rightly said.